Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of Convoco, welcome to the 2020 Convoco Forum. I am especially happy to be here with you and to welcome you. It's important, especially this year, that Convoco can take place, because if not now, when is Convoco called upon to make a contribution? An exchange is important today because our world, our society, needs orientation following the experience with the pandemic. What will the world look like after COVID-19? 1/5 of the new century is behind us. The 20th century is history. The 21st century is showing its face and taking shape. It's marked by the technological and digital revolution, which underlies everything and is causing profound changes. The challenges, such as climate change or religious fanaticism, and the world's new movements and alliances have been apparent since the beginning of the new millennium, and especially since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. The new formations and issues which were already beginning to appear have come more to light with COVID-19. Social awareness has also increased. The virus as a catalyst. The pandemic has shown us that we all live in one world, that this one world is vulnerable, that we depend on one another, that today's challenges can only be met by the international community, that cooperation is essential, that issues such as climate, environmental pollution, and pandemics don't stop at borders, and that the blame game will not help. Experience with the pandemic has led to an increased awareness with respect to inequality and sustainability, certainly the two key issues in the 21st century. We've been observing more and more cross-border social movements, such as Fridays for Future and Black Lives Matter. New partnerships are emerging, so-called grassroots movements initiated by civilians. These movements do not stop at borders, and we also see new decentralized organizational structures and partnerships between stakeholders and interest groups which had never cooperated up until now. The buzzwords here are cross-border and cross-sectoral. There is a new grouping here, and we have an internal logic behind these groupings and relationships in society. They're the result of the current era, and they're the expression of a new awareness and an expression of the realization that we are in an international, mutually dependent relationship. The transnational grassroots movements have created a new awareness of solidarity, and at the same time, they are an expression of the emerging feeling. They display global coordination and cooperation, which are becoming stronger and stronger. Fridays for Future, for example, cooperates with conventional institutions and with the business community. From the UN in New York to the WEF in Davos, we can observe new forms of multilateralism. Germany and France launched the Alliance for Multilateralism, and with this initiative, more than 50 countries strive to strengthen the rule-based cooperation. More and more governments are cooperating with the private sector on questions which initially were purely sovereign tasks. The clear, tangible, and cross-border cooperation between science and the private and public sectors to develop a vaccine documents these new alliances. In the security sector, the data analyst Palantir, for instance, advises the U.S. Immigration Agency and the police in the German state of Hesse. The German state and private companies cooperated to develop the Corona Warning app. Major technology corporations such as Microsoft, Alphabet, and Amazon are becoming more and more integrated in U.S. defense. When it comes to cybersecurity, Brad Smith, president of Microsoft, says cybersecurity is a common course in which we not only could partner but need to work together if we will to make real progress. And when it comes to the WannaCry and NotPetya attacks in 2017, acting together, governments and tech companies had accomplished more than any of us could have separately. It was a new beginning. There are new players since digitization plays the decisive role in securing future power. Power is diversifying because of the new technologies. More and more and smaller players are appearing next to state players. New partnerships are also emerging in fields such as urban planning and diplomacy. Meanwhile, there is now a track to diplomacy. NGOs are now acting as mediators more than ever before in conflicts where the community of nations has proven incapable of finding solutions. Examples include disarming the ETA and the peace treaty between FARC and the Colombian government. Worldwide, there are still more than 100 armed conflicts, so this figure illustrates how important this form of diplomacy will be in the future. Entrepreneurs such as Bill Gates or Michael Bloomberg assume global responsibility for issues such as health or the environment. In addition to health issues, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation also takes up issues such as nuclear power. Research workers from all over the world come together to build safer nuclear power plants. The first prototype is being funded by China. This example illustrates the mixed role played by new large foundations. On the one hand, they build bridges and integrate, and on the other hand, they are independent players which influence the political agenda. All of a sudden, there is a group of extremely wealthy technology activists who, because of their wealth, devote themselves to socio-political tasks. The new tech activist is an unprecedented phenomenon. Jeff Bezos is just one example, albeit the most prominent. Last year, when I selected the topic for 2020, I had no idea how relevant the subject would be today. New global alliances, institutions, alignments, and legitimacy in the contemporary world. This topic can be subdivided into three major aspects, the first one being the new alliances and groupings I have just referred to. And secondly, institutions. Here we will focus on the questions: what role do they play? How do they come about? And most importantly, how can they be reformed? The third aspect is legitimacy, a common thread running through the first two. All three aspects are closely related. It is not all that easy to draw a clear picture because the world we live in is at a watershed, due, among other things, to strong technological disruption. Lots of things are moving, also geopolitically. First of all, we realize that we have to cooperate, but also we can see that rivalries are there. We're talking about predominance, dominance, and exclusion. Nationalism and populism are phenomenons of our era, just as cross-border alliances are. After the fall of communism, the unequivocal hegemon was the United States. For quite some time now, however, people have been asking whether this unilateral world order is coming to an end. Is our world now bipolar or rather, which seems self-evident, multipolar? And are we on the way towards a post-hegemonic era? It's difficult to answer that question. The fact that it's hard to find an answer is proof enough that something new is emerging. At least part of the reason why the world's institutions are under pressure is most likely due to the emerging change, because these institutions are products of the old traditional power structures. They are the result of the post-war order. Most of them were set up after World War II and reflect the 20th century world. The United Nations was founded in 1949, the World Health Organization in 1948, and NATO was founded in 1949. The World Trade Organization was established in 1995 at a time when the irreversible success of the liberal world order seemed secure. Just think of Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat. If our world is changing geopolitically, this unavoidably will have an impact on our institutions. Emerging countries such as India or Brazil would like to see their economic weight reflected politically as well. The strengthening of China and the growing rivalry between the United States and China bring geopolitical change and emerging tensions to institutions such as the WTO. The question is therefore, how can we reform institutions, or how can we replace them with new ones? And is there a will to do so? Because it's a question of holding on to and or acquiring power. Last week, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres made some admonishing remarks. He said, "Those countries which prevailed more than 7 decades ago have refused to consider the reforms required to change the balance of power in international institutions. The goal must be a complete, integrative, and equitable participation in global institutions." There may be some doubt as to whether these reforms and restructuring can be achieved peacefully. It is indisputable that institutions are an important factor for a stable world order. Let's take a quick look at the sense and purpose of institutions. What role do they play for individuals, for countries' prosperity, and for a stable world order? Institutions have 2 virtues. They combine a long-term purpose with an understanding of common good, and they can learn from and embody the experience of many. Every institutional life requires those belonging to an institution to have a broader framework. In this way, responsibility and freedom extend beyond direct actions. Institutions create a collective sense of responsibility. On this occasion, a few years ago, the philosopher Roger Scruton said that institutions are the best thing we have when it comes to giving the long-term perspective a chance. People learn loyalty, commitment, and responsibility towards other generations through membership in an institution. Let's talk about some national institutions. If you ask about the reason for differences between peoples and countries, you will find the answer in their different forms of geopolitical institutions. The economist Darren Etsimoglu and the political scientist James A. Robinson demonstrate this impressively in their book, Why Nations Fail. They distinguish between inclusive and extractive institutions, both political and economic. We refer to political institutions that are sufficiently centralized and pluralistic as inclusive. If one of these conditions is not met, they are not inclusive, but are referred to as extractive political institutions. China, ruled by the Communist Party, is an example of a society experiencing growth under extractive institutions. We will have to wait and see if this is sustainable, because the authors believe that for sustainable economic growth, economic institutions must be in a position to develop the potential of inclusive markets. They must be in a position to promote technological innovation and to invest in people. That will only succeed if institutions are inclusive, which means they guarantee security for private property, they provide a neutral legal system, and they offer public services to create fair conditions, allowing to act freely and to conclude contracts. We will see these requirements again later when we talk about the question of legitimacy. This now brings me to international institutions. Think of the role or the global role of institutions. We can conclude that institutions transform opposing elements into a homogeneous advancement of common aspects. They're an important superstructure on the way towards civilizing the world. When it comes to geopolitical shifts, however, the political scientist Ian Bremmer refers to the fact that we are now living in a G0 world. What he's saying is that G7, G8, or even G20 no longer represent the world. These are geopolitical institutions in crisis. And this leads us to the following questions. Who leads our world in a responsible way? Who defines the global agenda? And who, all things considered, has the authority to do so? The political scientist Maha Hossein Aziz, who will be giving a keynote later on, goes so far as to refer to a global crisis in legitimacy. Legitimacy is the third major aspect in this year's forum. What is legitimacy? How is it defined? What is it derived from? Legitimacy is recognition by state and non-state players. There are various approaches towards defining legitimacy. It's not easy to find a clear-cut definition. We should note that not everything that is legitimate is legal. The question is, therefore, how do all of these new concepts and actions I mentioned above, how do they all fit into the concept of legitimacy and legal responsibility? Where do the new players and alliances get the authority to perform tasks, some of which are sovereign? Do they have the authority because they are pursuing a good purpose? Does money give them authority? Or is something legitimate because we allow it? In other words, we accept it without a challenge. Or do all of these new alliances and players lack legitimacy? This brings me to the question as to the basis of international solidarity. Phases of upheaval are always phases of unrest. The result can be social tension and geopolitical conflicts. Back in 1986, Ulrich Beck described the path towards a new modernity. He referred to a risk society, a society that comes together due to common shared risks. He coined the term solidarity through fear. In contrast, the macro-sociologist Heinz Buddha refers to solidarity through a sense of vulnerability. Both approaches lead to a cross-border community of solidarity, because one thing is clear: the threats from climate change or pandemics do not draw distinctions. They don't recognize borders. And in recent months, we have all become aware of the fact that the latency phase is coming to an end. The invisible dangers are becoming visible and tangible. It is, above all, the universality and supranationality of the challenges that will require international agreements and global action. They will raise awareness of the fact that we humans are a community of solidarity and that animals and plants belong to this community. In other words, solidarity as a basis for the superstructure of conflicts of interest and cultural differences. Here again, inclusive solidarity and not misconceived, outwardly extractive solidarity, according to the motto, "It's us against the rest of the world." Heinz Buddha calls solidarity the puzzle of a strange complicity without a firm foundation, but which can make use of existential experience. You can only judge the benefit of solidarity if you're familiar with loneliness. Towards a new civilized world. That means a world where different cultures can coexist as equals, with the understanding that the hegemon is not necessary, in which they are committed to common rules and count on universal cooperation. This may still sound utopian today, but it must be our goal. Membership in institutions, a sense of solidarity, and the pervasive sense of vulnerability will help us to achieve this goal. In a world of growing nationalism and geopolitical rivalry, we will have to wait and see how the road to universal cooperation will take shape. On the one hand, as I mentioned at the beginning, we can observe new alliances and gatherings supported by a new awareness. On the other hand, power politics and economic interests strongly opposing one another. The world is moving. Thank you very much.